All right, you ready to find out what else happens in our No Talking by Andrew Clements? We're in the middle of chapter 17 where um, the students have already been told by the principal that they're to stop this contest, this game, and start talking normally. And they're not quite doing that. They're kind of finding other ways of still doing their 3 words at a time. But some of the teachers are now starting to think, So Mrs. Marlowe thought back to all the times in the past week when she'd had to yell at Kyle about his nonstop whispering, about his constant joke telling, about his never ending comments on anything and everything that ran through his twitchy little head. And she looked at Kyle sitting there quietly, giving her his full attention. And every other student was doing the same thing. And suddenly the idea of trying to make these kids talk, actually demanding that they all go back to being noisy, self-absorbed chatterbrains, it simply wasn't logical. So Mrs. Marlowe decided to go ahead with her lesson for the day, and she adjusted herself to the new normal, because the new normal was at least 10 times better than the old normal. In social studies, there were more oral reports, and Mrs. Overby called on Ed Canner and Bill Harkness to go first. The boys walked to the front of the room, stood shoulder to shoulder, and both of them looked down at the index cards in Bill's hands. Ed said, "Italy is old." Then Bill said, "The Roman Empire," and Ed said, "ruled the world." And Bill said, "For many centuries." And Mrs. Overby said, "What do you two boys think you're doing?" Ed said, "Giving our report." And Bill said, "On Italy?" "No," said the teacher. "You're still playing that game, counting the words." "But we practiced," Ed said. "We're ready," Bill said. And Ed said, "Can we finish?" Like the other teachers up and down the 5th grade hall, Mrs. Overby had to make a decision. Go with the flow, which promised to be very quiet and orderly, or call for the principal, raise a ruckus, and try to force these kids to be their regular old noisy selves again. As a student of history, Mrs. Overby knew about the power of a grassroots movement. She also knew about the power of civil disobedience. But mostly she decided that this no talking craze was actually a pretty good social experiment. Plus, she didn't feel like the kids thought they were winning and she was losing. It wasn't like that. They were just having a different kind of communication experience together. That's all. True, Ed and Bill's report on Italy was choppy and awkward and a little hard to follow as they passed the narration back and forth like a ping pong ball. But the boys made all their points, learning took place, and the whole class sat silently and paid close attention, and the next 5 reports went almost as smoothly. What more could a social studies teacher ask for? So like the other teachers, Mrs. Overby chose the quiet way. And she decided she'd talk to the other teachers later in the morning and see how they were handling this thing. And she'd talk to Mrs. Hyatt, too. Language arts was the easiest class for the kids. Mr. Burton didn't even try to make them stop their activity. If they wanted to be quiet and talk only in 3-word bursts, he was all for it, no matter what the mighty Mrs. Hyatt had said. After all, this was his classroom, wasn't it? And if he believed this way of using words could provide a good language arts learning experience, then couldn't he proceed with it? Yes, absolutely. But he wasn't foolish. He walked to the back of the room, stuck his head out into the hallway, looked both ways, and then closed his door. Back at the front of his room, Mr. Burton said, "Eric and Rachel, please come up and sit in these chairs." When they were seated, he said, "You two are going to have a short debate. A debate is an orderly argument, and each of you will take opposite sides on the same issue. And the question is, should there be soft drink machines in school cafeterias? Rachel, you will argue for this question, and Eric, you will argue against it. You will take turns speaking, and you may use no more than 3 words for each statement. Ready?" Eric and Rachel shook their heads no. Mr. Burton said, "Don't worry, you'll both do fine. Eric, you first, and you may begin." Eric said, "Soft drinks, bad." Rachel shook her head and said, "Not bad, delicious." Eric frowned. Too much sugar. Rachel said, I like sugar. Eric shook his head. Sugar rots teeth. Rachel smiled a big smile. Not mine. Eric said, milk is better. Rachel shrugged. Try sugar-free. Eric said, still bad. Nutrition. Rachel held up her arm and made a muscle. I eat vegetables. Eric said, not everyone does. Rachel said, I like choosing. Eric said, soda is expensive. Rachel pulled $1 from her pocket. I have enough. Eric said, spend it smarter. Rachel said, what about freedom? Eric shook his head. Not at school. Rachel smirked. Very bad news. And they went on like that for about 5 minutes with no let-up. All the kids were fascinated, of course, so was Mr. Burton. And, of course, so was Mr. Burton. He took furious notes, writing down each response, trying to record the kind of gestures the kids made, their facial expressions, their tones of voice. Very few words were being exchanged, but whole worlds of ideas were floating around as the kids tried to build their arguments. They got emotional, and the 3-word limit was clearly a problem. Still, they packed a lot into so few words. It was like debating with a condensed haiku. It was also sort of like listening to cave people talk, or maybe Tarzan. Hungry, eat now. And Mr. Burton wrote some 3-word chunks of his own, which he intended to use in his human development paper. Every word counts. Choose power words. Hemingway would approve. Focus and narrow. Ideas are collapsible. Remember Miles Davis. And as he looked at what he wrote, he thought, maybe I should write my whole paper using 3-word sentences. That would certainly get the attention of my professor. In music class, the kids entered the room and sat silently, just like yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Akers was sure the students were going to disobey Mrs. Hyatt's orders, and she was ready to take some drastic steps to stop this nonsense. But when the piano played an introduction and launched into Over the River and Through the Woods, everyone sang right out. The teacher was amazed. Mrs. Akers felt like there had been a glorious victory for the forces of law and authority. And she intended to write the principal a special note to say thanks for her strong leadership. In fact, though, the principal's talk was not the direct cause of the singing. Taryn had written a simple note, and she'd shown it to all the boys and girls as they came into the music room. Singing is not talking. Deal? And by nodding, all the boys and all the girls had silently agreed that bending the contest rules a little was a good idea. Besides, no one wanted the Thanksgiving program to sound lousy, and their contest would be over by then anyway. The boys and girls first in that first period music class might not have noticed it, but the important thing was not that they had agreed to sing. The important thing was that they had agreed about anything. 5th grade boys and 5th grade girls at Laketon Elementary School were actually cooperating and helping each other. And that's what was happening in the other 5th grade classrooms too. The boys and girls had joined forces without even realizing it. Together, they had resisted the pressure from the principal and from their teachers. They had used their wits and teamed up to prove that not talking was a simple, harmless activity. It wasn't like the boys and girls were getting all buddy-buddy or anything, and it wasn't like the teasing and taunting had completely stopped, because old habits are hard to break. But still, cooties were dying all over the place. That was one result. Another result of the morning classes was that the kids had won a new kind of respect from their teachers. Teachers have great respect for order and self-discipline. Teachers love to make careful plans and then put them into action. It's what they do. And teachers hate noise and disorder and bouncing kids because these things keep them from accomplishing their careful plans. However, there was one gigantic problem with all this harmony and order and balance and peace that was blooming in the 5th grade hall. Mrs. Hyatt wasn't in the loop. She was clueless about these new developments. In fact, the principal wasn't even in the building during the morning. She was across town at the district offices working on the next year's budget. She had left her trusty teachers to carry out her strict orders, but Mrs. Hyatt had organized her meetings to be sure that she would be back at her school in time for fifth grade lunch, because the principal felt sure she would be needed at lunch. With her bullhorn to keep law and order just like always, Mrs. Hyatt had complete confidence in her teachers. She was sure that by the lunchtime, everything would be back to normal. Well, we'll have to find out what else happens tomorrow, or not tomorrow, next week. Chapter 18, Adventures in the Red Zone. We'll find out about that next week. All right, so hang in there and we'll find out some more. See you soon.